anything else here due to this.
Do you need a separate recording? Or do you have it? They have it.
You got it? Okay. All right, good evening, everyone. It is Tuesday, March 1st, 2022, and it's 6 p.m., and you are at a Wausau Waterworks Commission meeting. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We have most of our members here. We are missing one member. We anticipate him showing up at some point here. The first item on our agenda is to approve the minutes of the January 4th and February 15th, 2022 meetings. I would entertain a motion. I have a motion by Herbst and a second by Jean. Any comments? Okay, otherwise, all of those in favor of approving the minutes for January 4th and February 15th can signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, that passes unanimously. Thank you. Next up, we have our director's report. I'm going to flip it over to you, Director Lindman.
Yeah, number of items on the director's report. A few for the water, mostly for the wastewater. Some update modifications on the WPDES, the Wisconsin Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. That would be our permit on the wastewater side for some dates. But if any of the commissioners have any questions on that?
You asking about the wastewater division?
Or water, that's on the, I just pointed out, Jim, the WPDES, the draft modification permit is in there with some updated dates.
Okay, so we're going to have a pretty robust discussion of the Pfos issue later on, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep, Mr. Jean.
The employee that just resigned, did he take another job with another utility or community, or we don't know?
I'm not sure. Do we know? Move to another community. That I don't know. I don't know if salary was a cause or,
I'm unaware of that.
okay.
Any other comments or questions? Yes, Mr. Force.
Yeah, I think a number of us are still concerned about, excuse my voice tonight, about staffing and shortages in personnel. And I know that extends across the most, if not all, the city departments. But this board has discussed the idea of working with local educational institutions to establish internships and apprenticeships. And I don't see anything coming forward on that unless item 7 down here is this summer aid requisition form and job description submitted to HR for approval. Is that something like we've been talking about?
That's for our seasonal help, Jim.
Okay.
But there was something that went to the HR committee that was citywide about apprenticeship programs.
And?
Passed
And
unanimously.
it
at committee.
did pass. Yeah, it was supported. So.
Well, do you know what we're going to do? Is there an action plan?
We don't right now, Jim. We don't have an action plan in place right now other than continuing to advertise for positions. Modifying job descriptions if we feel it would help but we don't have an action plan on the utility side for apprenticeship or anything like that yet. We do have one individual in our fleet right now, and he is working with that, so, but some of these positions we don't have a plan in place yet.
Well, I again would just ask, and I know that some of the other commissioners would agree with me, that we really need to move on that and do something regarding apprenticeship programs as a way of recruiting new people into the business. These are good jobs, good careers, good benefits, and I just don't think we're selling them to young people who are coming into the job market. That's all I have.
Okay. We are talking about the director's report. If there's anything anyone else would like to ask for any clarification on, otherwise we can go ahead and move on. All right, we're moving on. Item number 3, presentation on temporary and permanent PFAS removal options and discussion on a path forward. We'll have a presentation from Donahue and Associates and Becker Hoppy. So we're ready for you.
Is there a clicker or?
We might have to adjust it for you. We don't know if the battery's dead.
Okay,
Okay.
next slide, okay.
Yep.
Well, good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight and talk about the PFAS issue. We'd like to provide kind of a response strategy briefing that really is going to attempt to do two things. Two primary objectives, I guess, of tonight is, number one, maybe provide the proper perspective. And what we mean by that is, following the discussions here and the things that have happened over the last several weeks and last several months, I think there's some in the community that might think the city's not doing a lot to respond to this issue and provide drinking water less than 20 parts per trillion. But I think in actuality, quite a bit is being done, and a lot's being done rapidly or quickly. And we'll kind of talk about the things that have been done and will be done over the near term to help provide the city with a response to the PFAS situation. The other thing we'd like to accomplish is start giving you all, the city, good information that you'll use, or hopefully is useful as you ultimately develop your PFAS response strategy. And I think there's actually going to need to be, it's going to require 3 strategies. The first one is a rapid response strategy, something that's done very quickly to provide drinking water below 20 parts per trillion. Another strategy is going to be a permanent treatment strategy, one that provides drinking water below a PFAS objective for a generation or more. And then it seems like there might need to be another strategy, an interim strategy or a bridge strategy that takes you from the rapid response to the permanent strategy. So those are the 2 things we really want to accomplish tonight. I'm going to step aside and we'll let Susan Wakowicz from Donahue walk through some material.
Next slide, please. So I'm Susan Whitekowitz, a senior drinking water engineer with Donahue, and have been doing this kind of work in Wisconsin and across the upper Midwest for a couple decades now. So we thought it might be helpful to present data in a graphical form. This is the same information that you have seen summarized in tables, but we're showing it for each well and for the 2 entry points from the water treatment plant. And really what this graph does is it illustrates the proposed recommendations of combining compounds for a standard. So cycle 11, the proposed combined limits of PFOA and PFOS at 20 parts per trillion. And then looking ahead to cycle 11, the proposed standard that would combine PFOA, PFOS, and then some of the PFOS precursors. So again, just a graphical form of the data for perspective. Next slide, please. On this slide, we just want to lay the groundwork, and really what the takeaway here is to show that we need to be mindful with PFAS treatment and removal of the compounds from water, that it's important to consider the smaller chain compounds that right now we haven't talked about as much. We've talked a lot about PFOS and PFOA, but some of these smaller chain compounds that have standards proposed in cycle 11 will be important to consider as we move forward. And again, this slide summarizes lab data that has been made available on the city's website. Next slide, please. So regulatory landscape. I know there's been a lot of activity here in Wisconsin talking about our regulations. We just wanted to show you what's happening nationwide, what we're seeing from our colleagues across the U.S., and information that is available through the industry. Absent a federal standard, the state regulations, I think, can be best described as a patchwork of rules. Some of that's reflective of how the states regulate groundwater, and drinking water. There are some states that have specific aquifers that are only for drinking water use. There are other aquifers that are sort of sacrificed, if you will. So many states have no PFAS regulation for drinking water or groundwater. Those are the states in the blue. 8 states currently have an established level for at least one PFAS compound. And we'll talk about those standards as MCLs, maximum contaminant levels, or primary drinking water standards. The language is sometimes used interchangeably. Sometimes you also hear enforcement standard in the groundwater world. And then some states have advisories for groundwater or drinking water, depending on how they think of groundwater and drinking water under their own state regulations. Next slide, please. So for the 8 states that have PFAS drinking water, maximum contaminant levels or drinking water standards, this slide just shows you the variety in application of those standards. You can see that some states are regulating the various compounds individually. Other states like Vermont, Maine, and Massachusetts are looking at the sum of some compounds. You can also see that some states are looking at some compounds, some states are looking at other compounds. There's really kind of this mismatch of standards. But moving forward, I think everybody has, been looking at, what do we expect next? We are expecting sometime this spring, maybe it'll be summer, for EPA to publish health advisories for additional compounds, Gen X and PFBS. And then in the fall of this year, everybody's anticipating, again, no promise, what we're anticipating, what we're being told, what I'm hearing from folks at, like, for example, American Water Works Association, is that we're expecting to see a national maximum contaminant level for PFOA and PFOS. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Andrew Dow, and let Andrew introduce himself.
Hi, good evening. I'm Andrew Dow, another drinking water engineer at Donahue, and I'll be talking a little bit this evening about some treatment strategies for PFAS and some of the technical strategies and potential solutions that we've been thinking about as options here in Wausau. Next slide, please. So I think it will help to start this discussion by talking briefly about PFAS and their properties. So PFAS are a complex family of substances with a shared and somewhat unique combination of chemical properties. And that combination of characteristics explains their widespread use in commercial and industrial applications, as well as their environmental behavior. And even more importantly, helps us understand the tools or techniques that are available to deal with these contaminants or chemicals from a treatment standpoint. So there are a few things worth highlighting, and some of you may be familiar with this. The first is that these chemicals are comprised of very strong chemical bonds. In particular, the carbon-fluorine bonds that make up the majority of these molecules are some of the strongest bonds in chemistry. That lends these chemicals and the products that they're used in useful thermal and chemical stability, but the downside is that it makes them extremely persistent in the environment, very resistant to degradation, hence the moniker forever chemicals. It also means that they're difficult to destroy if we were to intentionally try to break these compounds down in a treatment process. Another characteristic of these chemicals is that they're comprised of 2 main sections, what we call a tail that's hydrophobic or doesn't like to be in water and tends to prefer carbon-rich substrates or phases, and then a charged or hydrophilic water-seeking head portion of the molecule. The combination of those two makes them useful as industrial surfactants and foaming agents. In fact, firefighting foams are one of the leading cause of groundwater contamination with PFAS in the U.S. But it also provides us with 2 different properties that we can exploit from a treatment standpoint to separate these compounds from drinking water. The hydrophobic tail will tend to associate with or adhere to and absorb to materials like activated carbon that are commonly used in drinking water treatment. And then the anionic or charged head can be removed from water by exploiting those ionic interactions with a process called ion exchange that we'll talk more about. Next slide, please. When we look at the landscape of treatment technologies that are available today, and in particular the menu of treatment techniques that are commonly used for municipal drinking water treatment, one thing that becomes apparent is that first of all, we're dealing with two overall primary mechanisms, either separation or destruction and transformation. In the case of widely applied separation techniques in drinking water, many of the most widely applied or conventional techniques are not effective or have shown to be ineffective in removing PFAS. And that's one reason why the finished water leaving the existing drinking water plant is similar to the PFAS levels in the water supply. There are a handful of maybe less widely applied but certainly mature separation technologies that are effective in removing PFAS. And those are listed here, and I had mentioned in the previous slide, which are activated carbon and anion exchange, and as well as higher pressure membrane processes with membranes that are tight enough to remove these chemicals by molecular size exclusion. In addition, when we look at destructive technologies or transformative chemical treatment technologies that are mature in the industry, those are not effective in breaking down these chemicals because of their chemical stability. So even when we use powerful oxidants like ozone or hydroxyl radicals that are generated from advanced oxidation processes, those are not effective in breaking down these chemicals. So we're resigned to separation strategies. Now, there are a number of interesting, more novel or developing technologies that are being explored at a research stage of development and a research scale. And a number of those are fairly energy intensive, so they're mainly the focus for treatment techniques to deal with more concentrated streams, maybe byproduct or waste streams of managing these chemicals, but certainly kind of an area of active study and that will define the future of managing these chemicals in the industry. Next slide, please. When we look at options to treat for PFAS today, and if we were looking for a solution to implement in Wausau's system, we're mainly looking at 4 mature technologies that are available and have been shown to be effective in removing these chemicals. One of those technologies, powdered activated carbon, while widely used in the industry for other treatment objectives, is not widely used for PFAS removal for a couple of reasons. First, it's not as effective in removing these chemicals to the extremely low or non-detectable concentrations that can be achieved with these other technologies, but also because the PFAS that's removed with the carbon ends up in a residual stream from the water treatment plant, and that can create disposal challenges, if not now, then in the future, depending on the ultimate fate of that waste stream. That waste disposal challenge is even more significant for membrane processes like reverse osmosis or nanofiltration, extremely effective, but considered, frankly, more of a brute force approach that are really only justified from a cost standpoint if there are other contaminants that need to be addressed aside from PFAS, or if the PFAS are present at levels that would make some of these simpler, cost-effective techniques more cost-prohibitive. When we look at granular activated carbon, this is actually a very simple process to operate and maintain. It just consists of a bed of granular media, typically in a steel pressure vessel that the water passes through. And when the capacity for that bed to remove these contaminants is exhausted, that contaminant is hauled away, typically for thermal reactivation, and then it can be resold in the market for additional use. So there's actually sort of a circular economy available for carbon at this time. Ion exchange is a very similar process where we have a media or material that removes the compounds in a pressure vessel, very passive, simple treatment. In this case, the ion exchange resin can't be reactivated, so it is hauled away for disposal by incineration or landfilling. But in general, for reasons that are, maybe somewhat apparent in this discussion, when other utilities have addressed PFAS or put in treatment for PFAS, it's most common to see granular activated carbon or ion exchange used because of the effectiveness, simplicity, and waste disposal advantages. Next slide, please. This is a graphic that I think speaks to that as well. This is based on a survey that we conducted of equipment suppliers for these types of treatment systems and reflects a number of installations that they have installed and some additional in progress ones noted in different parts of the country, although a significant portion of that total installation list was at an unspecified location. It's no surprise that the Northeast is leading in the country in terms of installations because of the more stringent limits there. But I think it's clear from this that, a lot of other utilities in this position have gone with these technologies. They are proven and widely used, even if not used yet in the state of Wisconsin for this specific application. And the majority of them so far are GAC, a lot of interest in ion exchange picking up, particularly in California and some of the largest groundwater systems in Southern California. Next slide, please. When we talk about a PFAS response and options for moving forward to address this issue, I think it's helpful to understand the actually fairly strong position that the utility is in at this time as a result of the decision made by the community to invest in the drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. So the new drinking water treatment facility was designed to meet a number of objectives, including objectives that go above and beyond what is currently achieved at the existing drinking water plant. And that results in a very high quality water that makes use of these technologies like GAC and ion exchange more cost effective in removing PFAS. It's less expensive to use and replace the media involved. Perhaps even more importantly, constructing a new drinking water treatment facility at a greenfield site with space for expansion and flexibility to accommodate additional treatment makes this more feasible and cost-effective to address than it would have been at the existing facility. So in that sense, the utility is positioned to accommodate things, and that decision was in part informed by the fact that regulations aren't static and that there's a need to accommodate additional objectives in the future, and this will undoubtedly not be the last of those. Next slide, please. The other thing that I'd want to talk about briefly, and that you've noticed in this simple schematic of the new drinking water treatment train, is that there is an anion exchange process that is installed at the new plant and would be used in the treatment process. But I want to explain a little bit more about the purpose of that, or the objectives that was designed for. So that ion exchange process was designed to remove natural organic matter from the drinking water, which is a complex mixture of natural organic molecules that in this case, as in a lot of other water supplies, impart a visible color to the water. You can see in the photo there that the picture on the left, or the sample on the left, is a photo of the current finished water in the system, and you can see a green tint to it, and then distilled water for reference, and a sample of the ion exchange effluent from pilot testing on the right. So removal of this organic matter has a few important benefits. In addition to the aesthetic benefit of color removal, it's also reducing what we call total organic carbon, which is a measurement of these compounds. And that's important in minimizing the formation of disinfection byproducts, which are carcinogenic regulated chemicals that can form when we disinfect water with free chlorine. The new plant was designed to include primary disinfection with free chlorine because of anticipation that the water supply would be formally classified as under the influence of the Wisconsin River. And so the treatment plant needs to provide treatment for virus inactivation and Giardia inactivation. So it's important that we minimize those disinfection byproducts. And then lastly, removing these organics reduces food for microbiological growth in the distribution system, which can otherwise lead to problems like corrosion and consumption of the disinfectant residual. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting questions that, of course, everyone will be eager to address is, whether the ion exchange process used at the new plant will be effective in removing PFAS. So the type of resin used is a strong-based anion exchange resin that will have affinity for a variety of contaminants that are negatively charged, and we do expect that it will have affinity for PFAS in addition to the natural organic matter being removed. Both are negatively charged, and based on the resin chemistry, we expect some removal. However, the key question is to what degree and for how long. And there are a few challenges associated with using the same resin and same process for removing both types of contaminants, including fouling from natural organic matter of the resin or competition from that organic matter. And more importantly, what I'll speak to next is differences in operation for these two applications. Next slide, please. So the distinction to make here is that the resin process designed for organics removal is what we would consider a regenerable ion exchange process, whereas resins that are employed to date in most municipal systems using ion exchange for PFAS removal are what we call single-use ion exchange resins. So with a regenerable resin process or ion exchange process, a service cycle consists of basically loading the bed with the contaminant of interest, in this case organic molecules, and that zone of ion exchange moves down the bed, what we also call a mass transfer zone, until it comes out the bed and we have what we call breakthrough. And the concentration of the contaminant in the effluent starts to match what's in the influent of the water. For an application like this, these contaminants, the organic compounds, are effectively removed with a brine regeneration, which is used for a lot of other ion exchange applications. And so by backwashing and regenerating the resin with brine and rinsing that salt out, we can restore the capacity of the resin to remove these contaminants, and we can repeat that over many cycles of removal and regeneration. So for an application like this, we have a service cycle on the order of weeks, but we can do that cost effectively over many, many cycles with the same resin. For a contaminant like PFAS, it's a little bit different. The PFAS are not generally removed with just a brine regeneration process and require solvents like methanol or ethanol that are not used in drinking water treatment plants in combination with brine to remove these chemicals. And that's, in the end, that's not necessarily a problem because of the minor concentrations of these chemicals. We can actually load a bed over many more bed volumes, or a service cycle of months or years before that bed is exhausted to remove the PFAS. So these are not regenerated and they're not backwashed because we don't want to disturb that mass transfer zone of PFAS chemicals. And if we were to backwash it, we could see some earlier breakthrough or less predictable breakthrough of those chemicals. Next slide, please. So with that background, there are a few options that we envision as viable or potentially viable permanent solutions at the new drinking water treatment facility for removing PFAS. One of those would be installation of GAC adsorbers downstream of the new drinking water treatment train. The other would be installation of a single-use ion exchange resin process downstream of the new train. And then a third option that's worth investigating further is the potential to substitute a single-use ion exchange resin with proven performance for PFAS in lieu of the resin that was selected for organics removal. There would just be some investigation that needs to occur into how effective that is and whether all of the treatment objectives, including sufficient organics removal, could be met with other modifications to the drinking water train. Next slide, please. So the pilot testing that's proposed and is scheduled to begin soon with approval from the city would be set out to address these three options or investigate all three of these options. The general schematic for the proposed pilot test is shown in the slide here, where we're using the regenerable ion exchange resin downstream of the existing water treatment plant filters to simulate the new treatment process in the new plant. And then we would have a column of GAC and a column of single-use ion exchange resin downstream of that process to verify that that is an effective solution for removing PFAS essentially to non-detectable levels. Option 3 would then also include a single-use ion exchange resin operated in parallel with the regenerable resin that would investigate that third option of potentially substituting a single-use ion exchange resin in the footprint of or in lieu of the other process. So the three objectives are really to observe the performance of the regenerable resin, understand does it remove PFAS, how much and for how long, characterize the PFAS content of the regeneration waste. We're not expecting it to be elevated for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but this will allow us to collect data to verify that. And then third, and probably most importantly, to collect data demonstrating PFAS removal from Wausau's water using 2 mature and proven technologies. And that data is an important basis for selection of a solution, obtaining funding for that solution, and ultimately obtaining regulatory approval for a permanent solution. Next slide, please. So the pilot testing will give us information about what does and does not work. In parallel with that, there can also be engineering evaluations done that will establish reliable cost perspective on capital costs for what it would take to construct these permanent solutions. Where there can still be some uncertainty or a range of uncertainty would be in what the long-term operating costs of these options would be. And there are really 3 options or approaches that could be taken. One is to, select a proven technology and just go forward and get a solution in place as soon as possible. The other option, if we wanted to reduce the uncertainty around those operating costs, is to do an extended pilot test that operates these media to breakthrough, which can take on the order of a year or more. Or if we recognize that the majority of that uncertainty is around GAC because it's more difficult to predict performance based on just water chemistry alone without pilot testing for a long duration, we can do an accelerated column test in the order of a few weeks or a month or so that would also provide some additional information comparing different GAC products and projecting the long-term bed life for replacement. But I think with all of that said, and with all those options on the table, it's just worth also noting that the uncertainty associated with the operating costs is a relatively small portion of the impact to the average residential user. And some would argue that the risk or uncertainty associated with that as compared to the debt service represents a relatively small out-of-pocket risk to the average ratepayer. It's really the debt service and the capital cost that has the biggest impact, and there's ways to maybe obtain support from a funding standpoint for that. Next slide, please. So the last couple things I'll mention are, I talked about potential permanent or long-term solutions. I'll just mention a few ideas that are also being investigated for rapid response solutions, in this case at the existing facility. So that really comes down to 3 options shown here. One is looking at addition of powdered activated carbon, again, just as a short-term measure to help get levels below 20 parts per trillion if that proves to be effective. That's being investigated through bench testing that's occurring this week. There's also the option of looking at a potential GAC retrofit into the gravity filters, installing a cap of GAC or replacing a portion of the sand with GAC. Not a cost-effective long-term solution, but again, maybe worth considering as an interim measure. And then lastly, installing a rental system of ion exchange vessels or GAC, if available, that would be installed on the back end of the existing plant to treat the water going out to the system and get levels below 20. Next slide, please. And then the last piece to look at, as Mike had alluded to earlier, is that there also should be a plan in place to have an interim strategy that bridges from any rapid response actions that are taken now with the existing plant online and when a permanent solution is in place at the new facility, whatever that looks like. And there are a few different forms that that interim solution at the new plant could take. One is that we could find that the regenerable ion exchange resin is for now an acceptable or viable strategy. The pilot testing will give us more information on that. Or that substituting a single-use ion exchange resin into that footprint or into those vessels may be a viable strategy. The other option is to look at powdered activated carbon, again, as just more of a bridge or interim solution at the new facility. And then lastly, to look at a temporary installation of a supplemental system, again, rental or potentially rent-to-own equipment like ion exchange vessels or GAC vessels that would be installed, kind of plugged into the new treatment train and treat the water produced from the new drinking water treatment train process before it goes out to the system. Next slide, please. I'll just turn it back over to Susan now to just talk briefly about coordination.
So Andrew's laid out all the technical aspects of some possible solutions. I'm just going to spend a couple slides talking about some of the other things that need to happen to implement these solutions. And so in Wisconsin, we have our drinking water systems are regulated by both the Public Service Commission and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. DNR has what EPA refers to as primacy for regulating drinking water systems, but Public Service Commission has authority over specific areas of drinking water systems, particularly looking at the ratepayers and impacts to them through projects. So this slide just illustrates some of those rules and regulations that we have to follow. So DNR plan approval is required for any kind of treatment, pilot study, that kind of work. I've laid out some of those elements that go into that plan approval process, which may include engineering reports, pilot study reports, pilot studies, DNR specific worksheets, and then also plans and specifications. On the PSC side of things, there's a what's called a certificate of construction authorization, or just a construction authorization, that is required for water treatment facilities when the cost exceeds $432,000. And then just to make mention that also on the drinking water side of things, and I say drinking water side because we, as opposed to like wastewater or remedial systems treating groundwater or some kind of waste. We also have to be concerned with a couple of industry-specific standards, and those are NSF 1661, which dictate basically the safety of components and chemicals for use in drinking water applications, and then also 10 state standards, which is sort of our Bible that refers to specific design elements of facilities. Next slide, please. So now I've talked about the rules. I'm going to just touch on the money. And this is just information that has been evolving and coming from DNR. Certainly you've heard about the president's visit and talking about infrastructure. This is also a piece of some of the federal infrastructure. And what is anticipated to happen is that for emerging contaminants, DNR is expecting Wisconsin to receive about $12.8 million over the next several years. So just want to make you aware of that. That funding will come down through the Safe Drinking Water Loan Program through the form of grants. And then one other avenue of funding that the city may be investigating, and we wanted to make you aware of, another client we're working with, the city of La Crosse, has been able to obtain a federal direct appropriation for PFAS treatment. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mike to close our presentation.
Thanks, Susan. We're almost done. Next slide, please. Appreciate everybody's patience. So this is a slide that attempts to kind of summarize what it appears to us a PFAS strategy would look like, those three major components. The near-term or the rapid response portion of the strategy, an interim strategy bridging the gap to your permanent strategy, which the city's going to probably use for a generation or longer. And again, I think to reinforce the point that the city's already actively looking at these things. If we could go to the next slide, please. Sitting through a number of the meetings, I think it was the Council of the Whole, the city's off looking at bottled water alternatives, or has already made progress in that regard. They're contemplating or looking at point-of-use filter options. There was maybe even some talk about distributed systems where people could go to these different systems around the city and pick up water there. But as we look at the system-wide alternatives, those alternatives that are going to put water into the water distribution system below a PFAS objective, the alternatives abound. And Andrew walked through a number of those. In each of those different categories, rapid response, interim, and permanent, And I think the message right now is those investigations have started. Bench testing started this week. Pilot testing has been coordinated over the last couple weeks, isn't it? And is scheduled to start in a week or two. And then on the heels of that, there's going to be an alternatives evaluation. That'll arm us with the information we need to look at the cost benefit of those different alternatives and present that information to the city. In addition, one thing that is being looked at right now, because we don't have time for bench and pilot testing, is the rapid response solutions, the full system solutions at the existing treatment facility. We've already started working with vendors and manufacturers and looking at that plant, and our goal is to have a sense of what that might look like, what that might cost, modifications to the existing drinking water facility. If a temporary system was brought in to meet 20 parts per trillion, what that system might look like, what it might cost, and there's a fair amount of moving pieces to that, how long that might take before it could be commissioned and sending water below 20 parts per trillion out to the distribution system. If we go to the next slide, the last slide, this is just to provide maybe a sense of some of the activities that are underway that have been performed already, some of the things that are going to be done in the near term, and also maybe reinforce the fact that time is of the essence. But I think the city is moving along quickly with these different things, but quickly, not in a hurry. You know, the famous basketball coach John Wooden said, go quickly, but not in a hurry. And I think the quickly part, we're being quick about it, but we're being smart and we're being deliberate so that you have good information to make sound decisions moving forward. A couple of things maybe to point out. Glad to talk about any of this or answer any questions. But as we said, I think we're intending to be at the March 8th meeting with an understanding of what a temporary treatment system or an interim temporary treatment system at the existing facility, what that might look like, what that might cost, and when that could be commissioned. The bench testing is underway. Our intention is really to put ourselves in a position to report information as we get it, maybe on a monthly basis, to look at some of those interim strategies in April, to look at some of those interim and permanent strategies in kind of the May timeframe, May-June timeframe, as we start getting our pilot test results back and we have better clarity on how things are performing. So I really appreciate all the time tonight, and I'll be happy to answer any questions y'all have.
All right, I am ready to have questions. It looks like Commissioner Force.
Yeah, Mike, good presentation, all three of you. I appreciate that. You said the pilot study was already ongoing?
It hasn't started.
All right.
I know there's a contract in limbo, but we've been doing the coordination.
Okay.
And making sure the manufacturers are assembling the different pieces of equipment that they need, and the hope is that that'll be shipped within a week or two and assembled on site within maybe 2 weeks.
And regarding the interim strategy, how long is that existing water plant going to function? Our understanding is it's on its last quarter or the last 6 weeks or the last 6 months. So an interim strategy there isn't going to last for a very, very long time, is it?
No, Jim, well, what I think the thought process was, so I think the construction documents require the new facility to be commissioned in late August, so the August-September timeframe for commissioning that facility and working all the bugs out. When we talk about interim strategies, I guess our first thought is those would be at the new treatment facility, that we may want to do something, add a supplemental step or a supplemental process at the new drinking water treatment facility. That's when we talk about interim, we mean something supplemental, sort of temporary, bridging from the point where you
Okay.
commission that facility till the permanent system is up and running.
Maybe I misunderstood. You would not be doing something at the existing treatment plant?
And Jim, that's the rapid response strategies that we talked about, possibly PAC, possibly adding granular activated
Okay,
carbon to the.
but my
filter.
point is, if we spent a lot of money on that, it wouldn't be there for very long.
We would not expect it to be there very long.
Yes. Thank you.
Mr. Robinson.
Sorry.
A few
Jim,
questions. One is, what's your actual experience been in dealing with PFAS contaminated sites?
Yeah, so this we have not designed a PFAS removal system here in Wisconsin. for
Have you
drinking
designed one
water.
anywhere?
No.
Secondly, what sort of volumes are you looking at from a treatability or pilot study? You know, what sort of volumes are you looking to run through there? If we're running 5 million gallons a day through our system-ish, what's your pilot going to be?
So the pilot was designed with 3-inch or 2-inch columns, depending on the media that's being used. So the color removal resin is a 3-inch column, the GAC is 3-inch, and the ion exchange is 2-inch. The overall flow rate to that system is on the order of half a gallon per minute, which is the appropriate loading rate to the color resin, and then that feeds the downstream columns, and then about a quarter of a gallon per minute to the ion exchange resin that's operated in parallel. So this is just at a small scale to collect data about the treatment performance.
So have you been looking at EPA's website relative to accepted or efficacy of treatment systems? They maintain a database relative to ion exchange and other treatments and their success. And how have you incorporated those findings into your presentation?
So one of the things, we are familiar with, EPA's information about like treatment techniques and best available technologies for different contaminants, and can certainly continue to review that information in conjunction with the pilot testing. We also had a detailed meeting with the Wisconsin DNR last Friday, and so all the heads of the wastewater division and the drinking water division and the plan review section chief were on that call. And it was a great opportunity to collaborate with them and talk through the scope of the pilot and get some feedback on any questions or concerns they had. But they expressed, agreement with the approach, and we're pleased to see the pace of progress. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just jump in. Mr. Robinson, I just want to go back to your question about experience. With regard to drinking water treatment systems in Wisconsin, removing PFAS, this would be the first one. That is, there are some systems, talking with DNR, there are some systems that are, in the conceptual mode. This one is the one that would seem to be moving along the most quickly, but there have not been any treatment systems approved for drinking water treatment in Wisconsin. And
There have, however, been systems that have been in place relative to groundwater treatment?
groundwater remediation, correct. I would submit to you that they, while using perhaps the same treatment technologies, they are different animals to work with. Because of the regulations. I also just wanted to mention that we were selected by the city of La Crosse to work with them on a very similar situation with PFAS treatment. Thank you.
Mr. Force.
You did mention the role of the DNR in approving these kinds of plans or treatment technologies. In the rapid response phase of this, would the DNR have any approval function? Because I have to say, in view of what I've read in the press over the PFAS levels recently, I was not impressed with the DNR's decision-making. And I'm not sure anybody was. So I'm a little worried that if they are in an approval role here, that we might not get a quick and efficient decision from them.
To answer your question, yes, DNR would still be involved in the treatment, both in reviewing a pilot study plan, the pilot study results, and then any design of a treatment system. Now, that's why we've initiated discussions with them already to try to understand what concerns and what questions they may ask along the way and try to be prepared for those, trying to make things move along as quickly as possible.
I guess I'm going to step in there too. I've had conversations with the Deputy Secretary of the DNR, and they've told me they want to work with us as quickly as we can. They're willing to turn it around. Same with the PSC. Yeah, and I see we have Kyle Burton from the DNR. I don't know if he wants to jump on and say anything, or if you're just listening, that's cool too.
Good evening, thank you, Mayor Rosenberg. I was thinking the same thing. We are committed to working very closely with Wausau on any interim actions taken as well as the long-term actions. We do not want to be a barrier here. We want to help Wausau achieve their goals, whatever goals those are.
Thank you.
Mayor, if I may add there, we were able to organize a meeting with DNR in very, very short order with some very, very busy people.
Mr. Jean.
I think it's important, and somebody from Donahue can answer this or expand on it. If there was a MCL of 20, us just achieving 19 is not the answer. So could you explain that? And maybe that would be our interim goal if we did something at the existing plant, but.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I can speak to that a bit. I think at some point it would be important for all the stakeholders involved in what in rapid response, interim, or long-term solution looks like to establish treatment goals for those three timeframes that we've been talking about. And that is a discussion that would, or a decision that takes into account a number of factors. So it takes into account, what's technologically feasible, what's financially feasible, what's acceptable to the public. And there are certainly utilities out there, particularly in other states where they've implemented treatment for this sooner, that have set goals of maybe as low as non-detectable PFAS, period. There are other communities that maybe have somewhat more relaxed goals, but that still certainly keep the drinking water in compliance with whatever standards apply. And so I think, that is an important consideration that I don't think has been decided yet collectively, but the technologies that are being investigated are generally capable of removing PFAS or most chemicals that are regulated to very low or non-detectable levels, depending on how frequently they're changed out.
Mr. Jean.
And I think that would speak to cycle 11, those other derivatives or
The
whatever.
precursors of
Yes.
PFOS. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So would they be likely be coming out too, or we don't know enough about that at this point?
Well, we do know that, so 3 of those precursors were detected in Wausau's water, and one of those is anionic, so it would be removed by both ion exchange or GAC. 2 of those precursors are actually non-ionic precursors, so they don't have that charged head in the molecule. Those were present in the finished water at about 4 parts per trillion combined, so that would be removed. Testing with GAC would confirm removal of those, not expecting to see removal of that 4 parts per trillion with an ion exchange process.
Mr. Robinson.
So is there any chance that we could use the rapid response as our pilot project?
Well, I actually, so in that sense, I think that if a rapid response were implemented, say with ion exchange vessels that were rented and put at the existing facility, that would also allow us to collect valuable data about how that performs. But one thing to keep in mind with that is that it would be simulating, what's treated by just the existing water treatment process plus that supplemental rental system, rather than simulating the new treatment process. So with the pilot, we have it set up with that small column of the color removal resin, which gives us the flexibility to also look at the new treatment train at that small scale, since the new plant is not online yet.
But there are portable ion exchange and portable GACs available from
Right.
the perspective of our understanding of the cost and the effectiveness of those. And we could, I think one of the concerns is what will it do to our system? I'm just looking at ways to accelerate that, and if you go with a larger scale, pilot versus, if you're talking 720 gallons a day under your pilots versus 5 million gallons a day in real world, there's a significant difference.
Sure.
And we need to know what those costs and the ramifications are. And, again, there is a growing database relative to the effectiveness of the resins used in ion exchange across the country. I would hope that we could utilize that database in driving some of our design and other things. But I'm looking for, I guess my goal here is to get an effective rapid response system-wide approach as soon as we can, and to use that information to drive our final line. I understand that there are some differences in processes, but I think that we're still using the same water source, albeit running it through some additional filtration and other processes. But again, I'm looking for, can we use the rapid response as our pilot test and accelerate that?
Right.
Because you're going with a higher volume.
Well, and I think to your point, maybe it's not an either or, but an and situation. So, we could do the small scale pilot to collect data in sort of the controlled conditions that we're trying to simulate. But then at the same time, that rapid response strategy could look at a whole spectrum of capacity of mobile, portable, rental systems that could be installed at the new drinking water facility to treat water. So, for example, like in discussions with Evoqua, they have rental units that are available that could treat basically the average day flow that's produced from the entire existing plant. But there's also smaller scale systems and everything in between, the pilot scale that we had proposed and what we're calling a rapid response actual like system-wide solution. And so, and that's one of the things that we're trying to also look at as quickly as possible is what would it take from a piping standpoint, chemical feed modification standpoint, hydraulics at the existing plant to get something in place at any of those scales and make sure that we can pump water through that system and get effective treatment and, the appropriate chemical conditions going out into the system.
Have you any experience relative to contact time and the need for a X amount of contact time for removal? And
yeah.
how is that coming into your, how will you evaluate contact time?
Right. So contact time is something that's well studied at this point and characterized for both GAC and ion exchange in terms of what's effective for PFAS removal, as you're likely familiar with. And so the pilot would be designed to simulate those kind of industry recommended or standard contact time conditions for the GAC and ion exchange resins that we looked at. And then if we were to implement any rapid response solution, it would, be designed to treat an amount of flow that would correspond to a contact time that effectively, removes the PFAS for the kinetics of that media. So for ion exchange, it's about a minimum sort of 2-minute empty bed contact time. And so that's part of the basis of any system that, say, Evoqua provided that dictates how much volume we can, or the flow rate that we can push through that temporary system.
Okay. I feel a certain amount of urgency to be working on this rapid response, and so I'm wondering how long until we can get something going, whether that's the temporary measures with Evoqua or whatever we're looking at. What is the timeline? I mean, understanding that the DNR, we'll have to work with the DNR and PSC possibly.
Sure. Yeah, I think what we're seeking to do as a first step and have information that we could report back on by, say, next Tuesday is do kind of the engineering evaluation that allows us to understand what does that look like and what does it cost and how quickly could we get there? What would it take from a construction scope of work and a construction sequencing standpoint to understand really what that time frame is? I think standing here this evening, we just don't have quite enough information yet to give a clear answer on that, but that's absolutely the objective we're working toward in short order, is to have an estimate of that.
And Andrew, if I can.
Sure.
If I may interject, just to explain, or demonstrate the urgency that we are also feeling, Mayor. We are anticipating actually tomorrow spending time, we have another process engineer coming in and, looking at the existing plant, looking at those facilities, the process piping, the pumping, all of those kind of things, so that we can gather all that information. I know Scott's like super excited to spend the day with us. Yeah. But, like I said, just to speak to the urgency that we feel as well.
Okay, and I guess my other question is, do you feel like understanding that we would be your first PFAS system, is there support we can get, I've talked to mayors across the nation now who are dealing with this, and, some of them have suggested folks from firms that have dealt with this in California over the last decade. Like, is that support that we can offer?
Sure. If some supplemental input was something that was important to the city, we'd embrace that. I mean, we don't, I think now's not a time to have ego. If there's somebody out there that you think you want their input, or you want us to find somebody to provide some supplemental input, we're all about it. Our objective is to deliver a successful project. Okay.
We've had a couple hands. Jim, Joe Jean, you've raised your hand, but I don't know. Oh, we're good? Okay, I'm going to let Alder Herbst.
First of all, I want to thank Donahue. I have 4 pages of notes, and you probably
Awesome.
covered about half of what I had down, so I really appreciate that.
Great.
I know when we talked last week regarding something we could do rapidly, it would either be the bottled water or the pitchers with the filters. And I guess out of curiosity, if you have this information, and I wrote this down, what is the evidence by way of lab test data that the proposed device, meaning the filters, to be supplied to Wausau area residents to install on point of use fixtures in their faucets, shower heads, will achieve a water quality of 20 parts per trillion or a max of the PFAS?
Yeah, thank you.
Any idea?
I want to stay in my lane.
Okay.
So do you guys want to answer that question?
I could speak to it a little.
That'd be great.
Okay.
That'd be great.
So, the point of use treatment and filtration is not typically like an area that we work in, because we're working at the scale of, municipal drinking water plants. I do understand, and I know that DHS and perhaps DNR have information on their website about like approved point of use devices that typically are certified to like an NSF standard for removal of PFOA and PFOS. But there are still some nuances in terms of how those devices are operated and maintained. Like they would still need to be changed out at some frequently to continue to maintain that type of performance in removing PFAS. And typically, I think they're certified technically to just PFOA and PFOS specifically, from what I've seen.
Okay, Andrew, as long as you're there, I'm going to ask
Sure.
you a couple other things. Would you have any idea what the service life of these devices would be, or would that also be on the website?
I don't unfortunately know offhand what the typical service life would be.
Okay, another one probably be on the website. What procedures and precautions must be taken in the removal and safe disposal of a filter device at the end of its service life? Again, would that be on the website?
Potentially, yeah. I'm not
Okay.
sure on that one. Yeah.
And then, this is great, who would install, if we decide to go with the filters, the pitchers for the city residents, who would install the proposed, which is unproven filter device, and don't throw anything at me, would it be the homeowner, the apartment owner, or the city?
Oh, understood, yeah. I know, I mean, typically, those devices tend to be installed by the homeowner, like my Brita filter at home, right? Or if there was something on the faucet head, but I'm sure there's maybe different avenues that could be looked at for that, yeah.
And then one last comment regarding sampling and lab testing. If we have these filters in the homes, we actually would be testing the performance of the potable water filter devices to ensure that the PFAS levels are less than 20 parts per trillion, or will it simply be assumed per the manager data and performance guarantee that the devices are meeting the proposed DNR/DHS limit of 20 parts per trillion for PFAS without verification? Again, information on the website?
Yeah, not sure about that one. I guess that'd probably be a decision about, how sampling is handled for individual customers.
So
and all
I'd
that.
also like to maybe add a little color to this, because I had a couple of plumbers in my office yesterday saying that they had installed a filter in a person's home, and they were concerned because they were told that we suggested this filter, and the plumber was concerned because it isn't certified, and there's a specific process it goes through, and they wanted to make sure we weren't sharing the wrong information. So I think probably, again, like what you are talking about is a system-wide solution. These point of use might have their place, and we probably need to find more expertise on this that works with that. So I appreciate it, but I also want you to know that like people are looking for these things. They're listening to what we're saying. So we should probably also be careful about how we're talking about these things too. Mr. Robinson.
So I see Dan Bowman on the participant list, so I want to put him on the spot a little bit. Dan, you've heard Kyle make the commitments, but from a regional perspective, I would assume that we would have that as well. And one of the concerns that I have, quite honestly, is it's expensive to teach someone how to deal with a new media and a new problem. And not that Donahue doesn't have capability, but there are nuances to that. Is there any way that the state would consider funding a value engineering component for review and bringing in someone with actual experience in PFAS removals in a water treatment facility as providing assistance to the city? And it would also be something that would be hopefully beneficial to the state. Other states have PFAS response teams with bringing lots of parties together, but could you comment on whether or not we could look to any funding for innovative approaches and models?
Yeah, thanks, John. I appreciate the question. It's a really good one, and I think the idea makes a lot of sense. In working with some of the organizations out there, American Water Works and others, I think there is an opportunity to do those things. The availability of the funding to kind of stand it up and see what's out there is probably more of a Kyle question because he does manage some of the budget within DG. But that doesn't mean that we can't be taking this to the Secretary's office and through two chains. One, the community up to your state legislators and the governor, as well as the department, taking a look at this and see if we can't meet somewhere in the middle to get something going quickly. I think that's a really good idea, John.
Other questions and comments? Mr. Force.
Just a couple for Donahue. Your work at La Crosse, could you describe what you're doing there? I also had a question on the disposal of the spent granular carbon. Is incineration the proper technology to regenerate the carbon or destroy the chemicals?
Yeah, Mr. Force, I'll speak to that second question just briefly. With the granular activated carbon, the reactivation process that I was speaking about that allows actually the material to be reused in the industry is like a high temperature thermal reactivation process. So that's more commonly used as opposed to actually like incinerating the media, not reusing it, whereas with the ion exchange resin, that is the only option, or landfilling. And landfilling technically is an option for GAC as well, but when there's these other more circular options available, that's like preferable.
Do you know what that regeneration temperature is?
I don't know. For the reactivation, I don't know offhand. It's very high though. Yep.
I can speak to our work with La Crosse. So our initial work with La Crosse was a feasibility study to look at various options for a PFAS response. They have 3 wells that we're looking at. You've probably heard about French Island, and that's where the wells are located. So we have completed the feasibility study and are working with finalizing that, and also then working with the city. Our next step is putting together the pilot study process for looking at treatment technologies.
Other questions? Yep, Mr. Force.
Yeah, a couple of things, and maybe I've missed something here. The what I won't call it the rapid response, because that's been something else that we're referring to, but the response to the public through through supplying in-home filters or point-of-use filters or bottled water. Is this something the council is taking up and that we really don't have any authority or responsibility here to deal with? Or is it something we should be discussing and dealing with?
We can talk about it. So I guess I can tell you a little bit. There's been some interest in the point-of-use filters. I know that we have an elder who is here, who has done extensive research on this and talked to some, even, I think, Duke researchers. I have been bringing in bottled water, working with the Neighbor's Place. We have some corporations donating, so we are able to serve the most underserved folks. And that's what we're doing now. We could probably do more. That's an option. Although if we're able to find a more equitable solution that includes rapidly deploying this rapid response, I think that would probably be the best for everybody in our city. I would welcome Alder Killian. I see he has got his hand up.
Thank you, Mayor. May I ask, is it feasible to ask a couple of questions about
I
the
think
presentation?
So. Sure.
Okay. At the beginning, there was a graph or chart that showed PFOS precursors along with other analytes or compounds, and it looked like, based on the wells, and you could see it in the visual representation, that those PFOS precursors, there was really a difference in some of the wells on the graph. And what I was wondering is, based on with other contaminants, sometimes you see a fingerprint or a profile, and when you see that type of reduction, if that's based on distance, might that indicate proximity to source and distance from source when you're seeing that type of reduction? That would be my first question. Then based on that, in the long-term plan, if there was source identification, would there be cost effectiveness with the treatment program to look for a new well up gradient of the eventual identified source, and how might lower levels in a new well reduce wear and tear on system treatment options? And so those are my questions. But if I just may address the filter very briefly, I had looked at the Duke study. I hadn't talked to those researchers, but I talked to a product manager at one of the manufacturing companies, and they did answer some of the questions Alder Herf said you had asked. So it was the Hydrovive company, and that was a filter that had performed particularly well in the Duke study, and it had shown reduction to below the method detection limit in the study. And when I inquired about the MDL, the highest was below 3 parts per trillion, and the others were much lower. I believe they claimed, and it's on their website, that their filter life is 6 months. And they said that can vary from, if it's a heavy usage at home. They claimed that there was some sort of unique stopgap measure that they had in place, where if it reached a certain threshold, essentially water would no longer pass through it. I don't know how that works precisely. But also, they, unlike other companies, they looked at water quality and the nature of the water in terms of what you had asked with the larger system, Mr. Robinson, about contact with the media, and they actually would build a device with certain pore structures and so forth, so that the contact with the media and the types of media used was customized for the contaminant and the water situation. They didn't mention how to dispose of it or what you have to do, but that's what I know about that. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I have your questions. Do you have them down? I know that we asked about a source and maybe drilling new wells. This is a comment I'm hearing from other folks too.
You bet. And I'm glad the question came up. Our company really does two things. We design drinking water and wastewater systems, and we don't get involved with contaminant fate and transport. We don't get involved with some of the forensics that is it Mr. Killian, that Mr. Killian was asking about? Yes. That isn't what we do. And I do think, before, I think you asked, is there a willingness to maybe work with some supplemental expertise from someplace else? There absolutely is. The one place where I think it would be particularly helpful at some point, just to be clear, we don't do fate and transport. We don't help with the forensics, and we wouldn't help with any litigation. So we really shouldn't comment on, does the data tell us anything? It tells us we need to provide some treatment, and it tells us maybe how we can treat it. As far as another well, Susan might be able to touch on that. I'm going to throw you in there.
Throw me right there, that's fine. So there's always the opportunity to investigate another well. The concern, and it kind of goes back to the whole idea of fate and transport, and at this point, one concern is, since all of your wells are impacted, how far do you have to move to get away from that impacted groundwater? What is the impact of the Wisconsin River? Perhaps could you go on the other side of the river and get away from it? The other issue you're faced with here in Wausau, and I've been working with communities in this area for a really long time and drilling wells for, well, not me personally drilling wells, working with wells for very, very long time. I grew up in a well drilling business. And you are limited to the aquifer that you have available here. So that's the other issue. Is it possible? Yes. Is it worth investigating? Probably. But again, the concern just becomes, how far do you have to go? And then also supporting the cost of a well. You have, the further your well gets from the rest of the treatment system or the distribution system, you also have the cost of water main and infrastructure. Thank you.
I see. Welcome.
Hi, Steve Opatic with Becker Hoppy Engineers, and seen me here before. Just had a couple things with additional well investigations. I don't know extensively where they have looked in the past, but I believe they have looked on the east side of the river at times, maybe up closer to the American Legion golf course. And if memory serves correct from hearing a couple of conversations with an older engineer at our firm, the water quality there was higher in manganese than the ones that we were working with today. Not saying that there aren't other potential areas where there could be better water, but you have looked in the past, and the treatability of that water was challenging and informed where I believe well number 10 was drilled for the city.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Alder Ryan.
Hi, Deb Ryan, 702 Elm. I know we're focusing on the PFAS at this time, but within our infrastructure, we are still dealing with lead in our water mains and some of our pipes and our laterals, which we estimate about 9,000, though I don't think no one's ever counted it, and then the plumbing that goes to the faucets. So I'm hoping we'll have a solution for the PFAS in a matter of 6 months or a year. But we're still going to have issues with lead in some sections of the infrastructure in the street, in the lead laterals, and going through people's homes, especially if they're older homes. So we still need to be looking at, in my opinion, bottled water or some type of filtering at a faucet, or taking the water from your faucet at home and putting it through this pitcher with filter for some that are in the lead impacted area. And we may be dealing with this, I hate to say, but for decades yet, because we're still not done. So I think we need to be dealing with the PFAS, but we need to start talking about the lead, and especially those that are impacted because we still have thousands of homes that are still impacted, and they really don't understand. And at a certain point, they can't afford to keep on running the water. They need a way to be able to filter it before drinking it. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we feel we've exhausted the questions we had on the presentation, and are we ready to move on to item number 4? All right, I'm seeing some head nods,
Just,
so, go ahead, Mr. Forrest.
2 quick questions, maybe the answers aren't that quick. The brief discussion we had on source identification, I would hope that that stays top of mind for this commission. I don't know if it's something we can address or deal with tonight, but it seems to me that the ultimate solution is to try to find out where this stuff is coming from, and is there anything we can do to mitigate that in the future? The second question I have, and maybe Eric could explain this, we're dealing with numbers that have come from sampling of the wells. As a commissioner, I'm not sure how much sampling was done. I know a little bit about chemistry, and I know that sampling is important, where it's done, how often it's done, what the numbers tell you, how they're calculated. Were the numbers that we're seeing a composite? Were there several tests or several samples taken? Were they just taken from the wells and not from water that is coming into or leaving the treatment plant? Those are questions that I have.
I'm going to add on to that question. I also have a desire to continue testing so that we, like for science, replicability, well, replicate it. That's not a question. Mr. Lindman.
So testing on the wells was done in 2019, and then testing on the wells and the finished water was done in January of this year, in 2022. And they were grab samples, yeah. So there
Did we
weren't.
see those numbers from the finished water?
Yes,
We did.
yes, yep, those are posted on the website as well. Yep.
Mr. Robinson.
I'd just like to point out that we are unfortunately not alone relative to the presence of PFAS, and that Rib Mountain is above the federal health advisory limit of 70, and Rothschild had their well, I believe it was 4, go down because they were above the proposed standard. So it looks as if it is an area-wide issue. We have begun to raise that issue in discussions at the Metropolitan Planning Organization level to talk about how, as an area, we might want to respond to it. But it is not unique to Wausau in this area, and I think that may limit our options as it relates to finding a clean alternative supply, because you've got hydraulic pressures and other things that impact groundwater flow and pull contaminants in ways not intended to be pulled, which impacts wells going forward. So I think realistically, we're probably looking at the need for treatment.
I would also say that the challenge that we have is also an opportunity, because we, as a region, are experiencing this. Maybe there's a way for us to work together. And we've talked to the EPA about some of those concepts. Okay, looks like we have a question from the audience. I'm not super interested in allowing tons of back and forth, but if there's a question.
No, of course. You had mentioned that identifying the source. So it seems that there's a source, or maybe potential multiple sources. Is it safe to assume that we don't have any more additional, since these chemicals have been banned? Theoretically, we're not using them anymore, putting any more, or do we have we found them anywhere where we can identify a source and know, where they're coming from and what we can do to clean them up? Maybe that's not the right question, but remediate existing. Will we eventually get into a diminishing return if we don't have new chemicals going in? I mean, is that a true statement, that we don't have any PFAS currently coming into our environment? I mean, 3M, as I understand, is the number one producer, or maybe the sole source producer of PFAS. Not true? So I guess the question is, do we still have people here using PFAS in manufacturing that would be coming into the ground?
So there are, I guess I can't speak for all manufacturers. I will say that when I was talking to some of the other mayors, they were dismayed because there are some federal standards that require airports to continue using PFAS foam, for instance. And so that's one of the problems, and that's some of the contamination that we've seen. We're no longer using that. And I would say we're also going to be working with the DNR to identify the source and probably that responsible party as well. So I don't know about how much more we will experience in the world. Mr. Robinson.
Let me try to answer that from wearing my Wisconsin Green Fire hat, if I can.
It's a nice hat.
There's 5,000 plus compounds out there with PFAS in the PFAS family. The primary ones, PFOA and PFAS, were long-chained PFAS molecules, and they replaced them with shorter-chained with the thought that they would break down and have shorter lives. But they're finding that there are additional health effects with them because of their mobility and absorption. So I think we're just really beginning to see this. The critical issue is how much fluorine and how much of the fluorine molecules in. I think we're going to need to begin to look at monitoring not just for individual compounds, but probably the family, and trying to set some standards going forward that would look at that carbon-fluorine bond and how we track that. But I think, unfortunately, we're just beginning to understand the issue, and the science is emerging, and the use of the products continues. Many people don't know they're using the product. California's looking at product bans, and other states are looking at regulating the use, but there's not a concentrated effort right now to really get all of the PFAS out, because we don't fully understand where they are and how they're used.
And not to get too far afield, but I will tell you that there's the director of the solid waste department for Marathon County knows a lot about PFAS. And I happened to be eating some ice cream near her, and we were talking about PFAS, and she pointed to the cup out of which I was eating my ice cream, and she said that is lined with PFAS. So it's everywhere. It's pervasive. I'm never eating ice cream out of a cup again. Okay, are we ready to move on to item number 4, where we might have some possible action? All right, I'm seeing some head nods again. All right, we're on item number 4, discussion and possible action to approve funding for the pilot study and scope of services for PFAS removal at the new drinking water treatment facility with Donahue and Associates and Becker Hoppy. Yes, Mr. Jean.
I believe I should excuse myself during this discussion, so I'll step out.
Okay, thank you. We still have quorum. All right, anyone want to kick us off? You heard about the pilot study, more questions about it? What do you need? Mr. Lindman.
Yeah, so the pilot study, at least that's what's proposed. There's, it's kind of written in a task order format in your packet. And so there's a task order 1, which is actually the pilot study, and a task order 2, which is more of a time and materials for providing the commission, council, and whoever else on updates through presentations and other information. But if you have specific questions on the pilot and what's being proposed, I know Andrew went over some of what's kind of already in the works with that, but if you have other questions, you can, they're here to answer those as well.
Mr. Robinson.
But again, at the last meeting, we wanted to look at it. I'm not, I was very impressed with the presentation from Donahue tonight, but again, this is an evolving area where expertise is valuable. And were you able to explore and talk to any other firms? I know that Wood PLC is doing work in the JCI Tyco site for the DNR. It's a groundwater treatment facility with granular activated carbon. There are other firms, I think CHM Smith and others that have experience. Have we reached out to others? What we're looking at is an area where we don't have any expertise. In my experience, I'll just go back to Holtz-Krause landfill, is that we opened that process up for RFPs and gathered a lot of information from the unsuccessful bidders relative to technology, processes, and other things that we were able to capture and use with the successful bidder and modified our scope of services. And again, I was very impressed with the presentation. I'm not diminishing their potential capability, but there are other firms that have real-life experience in ion exchange relative to PFAS, GAC, and others. How do we bring that expertise into our product to both, try to ensure the best possible results at the best possible price?
Well, the other option that we could do is we could do an RFQ and reach out to other firms, just on a qualifications based. Again, I'm not an expert in PFAS, so, and have them provide to the commission their, background on some 15, 20-minute presentations for that. And we can certainly do that. We can kind of shorten that time frame up to 2 to 3 weeks to have them out on the street and then bring them back for an April meeting or to do that as well, if that's something that the commission would want to move ahead with.
I see Mr. Forrest ready to ask a question.
John, I respect what you're saying, but I really am concerned about timing here. We need to move on this. And I guess I would address the question to the Donahue, Becker, Hoppy team. Familiar with ion exchange? Familiar with granular carbon? I mean, I have to think in your water treatment work that you've dealt with these technologies over and over and over again.
We designed an ion exchange system at your new plant.
Right.
The question is PFAS and the experience there, and I think there's, kind of a void of experience here in Wisconsin in terms of treatment technologies and the type of equipment that we're looking at here. We've got experience. We've collaborated with a firm that is a water expert on other projects, a firm called Corona, that we've collaborated with them on La Crosse and on a number of projects in Illinois. So we've got access to people who have, I think, the kind of experience from the West Coast. They do a lot of work in California, and the East Coast, they do a lot of work in the Northeast. I think if you wanted us to provide some credentials, we'd be happy to offer some of their credentials. Really, the aim here was I don't think there's a lot of patience within the community, and to get some good information as expediently, but have it provide us actionable information that we can use in a subsequent evaluation and even a design as expediently as possible. So are we familiar with the types of processes that we're talking about here? Absolutely. Do we have PFAS-specific experience? Not when it comes to design, but we've looked at these technologies in La Crosse and in Peoria and Illinois and other places.
It doesn't mean either that the pilot study can't continue, so we can start gathering information and doing that. If we want to add to the team that the city is using, we can certainly pursue that in parallel with this study moving ahead. So to have additional expertise on board. I would agree that the sooner we start gathering information, the better off that we will be in a position to put solutions in place and get decisions made.
Mr. Forrest.
Well, Madam Mayor, just to keep the wheels turning here, I propose that we accept the continuing professional services agreement with Donahue is that a cost not to exceed at $155,000?
Yeah, and then there's a task order 2 of $30,000 too.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, I would move that we approve both of these.
Okay, so we have a motion to approve the pilot study funding. We have a second by Herbst. Any further discussion? Mr. Robinson.
I understand that time is critical, but I also think that expertise and knowledge are, and again, I'm not saying that at the end of the day we won't be hiring Donahue, but I think one of the things that we tasked, what I thought or hoped that we would have is a little bit more understanding of what was going on with other firms at today's meeting. Based on last week's meeting, I know there was a short turnaround, but I see value in the RFQ process to bring that expertise in. And I would hope that we would go that process and try to accelerate it as much as we can.
Do you want us to work on that, John? I'd be happy to work on that and get that on the street and some other firms come back, take a look at, you know, what's going on. I guess the question is, you know, are we pursuing the pilot?
So, yeah, we have a motion on the table to approve the funding for the pilot, and then we have some discussion about maybe bringing in some expertise. Is that instead of or in addition to?
I think it's part of that process. It's, the pilot, the pilot, again, is a 720 gallon a day pilot. And my concerns are scale and scalability and expertise and understanding. And I understand that bench scale or that pilots are small in nature and tend to be done in a lab versus the field. But I think we would benefit from some additional eyes with expertise on this process before we commit those dollars. We're concerned about the ratepayers, and I understand the need, but I think we can concurrently be working on what can we do for a rapid response and then look at our long-term solution. But I'd like to see us get those RFQs, and part of that RFQ is they're going to need to run their own pilot and want to design their own pilot as part of that process potentially.
Okay. Input from others. I guess my question is, how quickly can we turn around an RFQ? Can we do that?
Well, I would think that it would probably be the next commission meeting, that we would have some firms available to give presentations for the commission to review, take a look at.
Okay. Is that weight acceptable to this body?
Or a special meeting?
I think I'm going to have it out on the street at least a couple weeks, if not 15, 17 days, and then probably, take me a few days to put it together. So by the time we get everything read and said and done, we're into early April, so.
What is?
I do think, just as an understanding, I mean, this isn't going to delay this a month. It's going to delay it well beyond a month, starting the pilot. So just with, trying to get the equipment made, built, pursued that way. There's nothing that says we can't expand the pilot study to something different, John, but I think with these proven technologies, it would be my recommendation that we move ahead with this pilot study and get something started. In parallel, we can do an RFQ to get some additional experience on, with us too. But with the pressure that we're getting from the community and stuff, I don't think delaying this for a couple months to even get started is.
Well, let me try to set the context, though. The context is for a pilot study for a long-term solution. And that long-term solution, what we heard is the pilot study is going to take a year. How long will the pilot study take?
So yeah, I can clarify that a little bit, Mr. Robinson. What we were thinking for the scope of the pilot study that we had proposed that could start as early as mid-March was what we would consider a proof of concept pilot study. So it's allowing us to collect information about specifically the resin that we're using for organics removal at the new plant, first and foremost. But just as importantly, it's allowing us to collect information about the performance of GAC and ion exchange, not with respect to running them to breakthrough, but to verify essentially that we see non-detectable levels of Pfas or the Pfas that are removable by those technologies in that pilot study as a basis for verifying their efficacy. If there was interest in doing a pilot to select the lowest cost media to operate over a life cycle and compare, maybe 5 or so different GAC products and different ion exchange technologies, that could be a larger and longer pilot in scope, and it would be important to run those products to breakthrough over the course of a year or more to collect that comparative data about bed life to optimize exactly, the long-term operating costs.
So, so in the context of your pilot, so you do your proof of concept pilot, and then what? When do we have a system in place for an ion exchange resin or GAC in
Right.
place? When do we have the system design so that we can implement it?
So, yeah, the proof of concept would give us that data or basis for saying that with Wausau's water, this works. And frankly, for a couple of the options that we'd outlined, we expect it to work, but it's verifying that in the pilot. And then, these are preliminary and fluid discussions, but in some of the discussions that we've had with Wisconsin DNR and other, potentially relevant stakeholders, they understand the urgency of this issue and that time is important to this community and to solving this issue. And I think based on the data collected with Wausau's water and the precedent in other states, even just the basis of installations that we showed earlier of all the other utilities using G or C and ion exchange, there might be a pathway to get that, or likely would be a pathway to get that approved, designed, and built without waiting to do an 18-month pilot test, if the community felt like that was the right approach. Can certainly do that, or can even do that once the solution's online to change out the media later on and continue to optimize those operating costs. But in terms of getting to a solution as fast as possible, proof of concept pilot, submit plans and specs and an approach to DNR, and get that designed and approved is the fastest way to get something in place.
I just want to clarify there with regard to pilot testing. DNR code indicates that a pilot test is needed. DNR does have the ability to waive that pilot test in very, very limited circumstances. In talking with them and recognizing, I don't know if Mr. Bauman is still on the phone, but the expectation is that there would be a pilot test because this is a very important system. So there is an expectation that there would be a pilot test. And I have to say, in the vast majority of any kind of drinking water treatment systems that I've been involved with, there is a pilot test of some sort.
Any comments, questions? Ms. Herbst?
I do believe that we are going in the right direction for the city. And my only comment is our levels right now are from 23 to 48 parts per trillion. My uptick on this is these are 67% and 31% respectively below the current US EPA national maximum of 70 parts per trillion for drinking water. Definitely we need something for rapid response, but we also, I think we're on the right path for this down the road. I mean, we can't do this overnight. That's a given. Thank you.
Mr. Robinson?
So I would be willing to go with the pilot test, but I want somehow some expertise brought in. And can we go with a value engineering contract to provide oversight and consultative services to the city as we approach this issue? I think that allows, I can count. I think it lets us bring in that expertise from those other firms. And quite honestly, we found in several projects that I've worked on, when you bring value engineering in, there are savings at the end of the day, typically on design features, but I think this is just something unique to all of us, and I think we would benefit from an independent third party doing that value engineering and review.
Mr. Robbins, if I could just briefly, I think we pretty regularly collaborate. A lot of times, value engineering often means look at our plans and specs. And I think, we're on the same page there. But we often will reach out to different experts or individuals or firms that bring different expertise to projects. And for whatever it's worth, as you contemplate your decision here tonight, again, I just want to reiterate, we'd embrace, if it's important to the city to bring some other perspective and experience, then it's right for Wausau, and that means it's right for us, and we'll embrace that, okay? So there's a willingness to do exactly, I think, what you want to do on our part.
Okay. Is there, Mr. Force?
And John, again, respecting your concerns, it seems to me we're going to have an opportunity after the pilot study and after we know the results to then begin designing a system, if I'm looking at it in my pedestrian way. And there's going to be opportunities for, I think, what you're requesting here. I just don't think we want to get anything in the way of getting this pilot study underway as quickly as possible and getting reliable results as quickly as possible. That to me is step one. Step two, we go beyond that, and it may be this engineering firm, it may be another engineering firm, it may be two or three, I don't know, but it seems like we have an opportunity at that juncture to do some of the things that you're requesting.
Mr. Robinson?
Well, again, I think that it's critical to have that involvement up front, in as early as we can, both from the concept of design, tweak, and others. But perhaps we should vote on this motion, and I would offer another one upon dealing with that.
Okay. Do we feel ready to vote on this? All right. So the motion that we are voting on is to approve funding for pilot study and scope of services for PFAS removal at the new drinking water treatment facility with Donahue and Associates and Becker Hoppy. All those in favor can signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay. That has passed unanimously. It sounds like we might have another motion. Mr. Robinson?
Should I bring Joe in?
I would move that we direct staff to request qualifications for providing services to us to help evaluate pilot projects and options following the value engineering concept.
All right, so we have a motion on the table to direct staff to find another expertise here to provide value engineering. Is there a second?
I'll second that. But I would like to point out, John, the firm that we're hiring for the pilot work is the firm that's designed the water plant. So there is consistency there.
All right, so just to get our Commissioner Jean up, we've approved the pilot study, and now we're talking about maybe bringing on another resource consultant, value engineer to work alongside these folks to make sure that we're doing the right things and we're bringing in a level of expertise that maybe that we'd like to see. So, Mr. Force.
Are we considering that, John, or does your motion say we will do that, we must do that?
I'm directing staff to prepare, the motion is to direct staff to prepare an RFQ. It doesn't commit us, we're going to evaluate the firms at the time that the qualifications come in.
Okay, we're directing staff to prepare an RFQ. Mr. Jean.
Can we do that based on how this was agendized?
I'm looking at my parliamentarian, she's shrugging. I think that as it relates, do you want to help us out here, Ann? Because I think it's related, but it's not exactly.
Yeah, it's a close one, I think, when it comes to germaneness. I think that could be argued either way. Does the body have any feeling about whether they feel that's germane or not?
I guess in my point of view, and I guess I'm the chair, I find it germane because we're talking about the same pilot project.
There's the connection. There's the connection.
Is there any opposition? Mr. Jean?
Well, if we're going to have a meeting next week, are we hurting ourselves to put it on the agenda properly and react to it at that time?
Are we having a meeting next week, or is that the?
Well, I heard to discuss.
Council meeting.
Oh, that's
Yeah. Okay. So
I'm really questioning the germaneness. I understand it's connected to that, and I understand what Mr. Robinson's trying to do, but you've agendized the approval of the pilot study, the funding for it, and the approval of the specific agreement and scope of services that were contained in the packet for Becker, Hoppy, and Donahue. So I'm really moving toward that it's not really germane, but I'm wondering if that could be taken up by council, not coming from committee on Tuesday night, if there's an urgency to move that along.
Yeah, and we do also have some other agenda items that maybe this could fall under, but also I like the idea that we could direct the council. I feel that we have enough council members here that have kind of heard the discussion, and we can further this.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what do you think? I tend to want to follow the parliamentarians' sway, but I'm willing to be overruled. Yeah, Mr.
I'll
Robinson.
just throw out for purposes, for item 5 is discussion and possible action on interim PFAS remedial options, including funding recommendations until a new drinking water treatment facility is operational. I think that's a pretty broad
I do
one.
too.
And the other one was limited only because with Donahue and Associates and Becker Hoppy was added to it. So
I find that acceptable if we are ready to move on, since we voted on this item.
we haven't,
Well, we voted on the pilot study,
Yeah.
but we have a live motion that was challenged for germaneness based on this agenda item. Right. Okay, so if it pleases this body, we'll move on to the next agenda item, and maybe we could we could make a motion related to that. Does that sound good? Looking back at the parliament. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I see nodding. Okay. I feel good about that. All right. Just making sure it's okay with Mr. Force who seconded that. Okay. All right. We are now on to item number 5, discussion and possible action on interim PFAS remedial options, including funding recommendations until the new drinking water treatment facility is operational. I would entertain. Yep.
I'll make the same motion. I will move that we direct staff to develop an RFQ for consulting services to provide value engineering type services relative to the pilot test and our approach to the PFAS contamination.
All right. We have a motion on the table. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All right. We have a second by Mr. Force. Any further discussion on this? Mr. Jean.
I think there's enough latitude. I'm not positive under this item, but I don't want to read about it. So if you want to think about it some more or inquire about it with our attorney, I'd appreciate it.
I did get a little head nod, but I am willing to bring her forward again to answer the question if there's any further dispute.
Not knowing what the presentation would include and having consulted with the mayor prior to this agenda having gone out, I think that was one of our concerns, was that we wanted the agenda language to be sufficient and specific enough so that the public could understand what you may be talking about. On the other hand, some of these are kind of broad because we weren't sure what information would be brought forward. I think when you're talking about remedial options, I suppose making a motion to bring in or to get RFQs to bring in qualifications of consultants to address those remedies would be germane.
Okay.
I mean, that's the way I would look at it.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and rule this one as germane. So thank you. All right. Further discussion. If not, all of those in favor of directing staff to prepare an RFQ for consulting services for value engineering for remedial issues for PFAS can signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Is there any opposition? We have one no. All right. Is there further action we'd like to take on this agenda item, or are we okay moving on? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. We are now on to item number 6, discussion and possible action on approving terms of settlement agreement between Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the City of Wausau, providing for dismissal of both contested case and petition for judicial review. This is Marathon County case number 19CB32. Yes, oh,
I had raised my hand before.
sorry.
I'm still concerned about our rapid response.
Okay.
And where, will we deal with that later in the agenda?
I mean, I guess we can talk about that now. We'll go back to item number 5, since I didn't see you raise your hand. You have the floor.
Well, I'm wondering, because the pilot project is moving us toward that permanent solution, which is the new treatment plant. We have the issue of how do we address the PFAS in the system on an interim basis. I would hope that we would continue to explore a system-wide approach, and I know that there are mobile units that are either located at the treatment facility and/or at individual wells. So how do we advance the interim or the rapid response relative to trying to remove PFAS on an short-term and interim basis? And we really haven't talked through that.
All
The
right.
contract doesn't deal with that specifically.
Let's do that now.
Task Order 2, the time and materials contract was intended, this is happening very quickly. We wanted to respond quickly. The scope will no doubt be somewhat fluid as we move forward in terms of attending meetings, providing information to the public, and arming all of you with good decision-making information. If we could go to the previous slide.
That might take a second.
I'm trying to answer your question, Mr. Robinson. So what we've talked about is part of the rapid response, full-scale solutions at the existing drinking water treatment facility. We've identified a number of different things. Potentially PAC. Testing for that has started this week. Retrofitting the filter with GAC, we're looking at that. And then we're currently working with equipment providers to look at a temporary system, temporary canisters of resin to meet the objective of 20 parts per trillion. We're doing that now, and task order number 2 will help us to continue to do that. I guess, again, in the interest of time, our intention is to be back next week. We got a lot of work to do. Next week with some sense, working with those vendors, some sense of what it would cost, what it might look like, and how long it might take to commission a system like that. Certainly welcome to have others look at that too, but in the interest of time, we wanted to come back next week with those types of answers. And then as quickly as we can, as quickly as we have meaningful information from the bench testing, we can investigate some of those other PAC alternatives. So one of the things that we wanted to point out is I think stuff is being done in this regard, and that's the intention over the next couple of weeks. And task order number 2 will help us do some of that.
Any other comments or questions, needs, motions? Mr. Jean?
It seemed like it would be a little premature to act on something here until we have more information for,
Seeing some
and hopefully in the
agreements.
near future, as suggested by our consultants.
Mr. Robinson?
I don't disagree that it's premature to take the action, but I think what we need is a timeline, if we can, or sort of an outline of when that will occur, because if we keep delaying it, the rapid response will be the final response. So if we could, do we have a timeline for what those alternatives are? Should we expect that in April we'll be able to address that rapid response?
Well, Donahue is going to present something to the council next week on Tuesday.
But doesn't it have to run through us? So will that be a joint meeting, or is it
We could try to set something up. I mean, I mean, the attorney's here, but, I mean, the reality is, you know, I mean, the council, you know, they can make those decisions. That was kind of the point that they wanted, that those options put before them. We've been working on them, but we don't have all the details right now, as Mike had said, and so, you know, we're working through those. But, you know, one of the options that the council wanted was to take action for possible expenditures of funds and committal of funds for these options, so.
Questions?
So I assume then that that would not affect rates.
So it depends on the funding source, right? So
Right.
the council could approve alternative funding source that we're not ratepayers. And I suppose they could also kick it back to this commission if that's not the direction they wanted to go. Yeah, Mr. Robinson. Oh, you looked like you were ready to say something. Okay. Is there, what else do we need to talk about here as it relates to rapid response timeline?
I mean, I would prefer that the commission would evaluate those alternatives, but, you know, so it would just be a timing thing, you know, on what that would look like. So, but just as, from a staff perspective, I think that, you know, having the commission weigh in on those, so if there needs to be, we have some discussions on some possible meeting dates and times at the end of the agenda too, if you wanted to take a look at maybe having a special meeting, possibly that same day. That could be done as well.
Just brainstorming here, there is a finance committee meeting ahead of the council meeting. Might it make sense to have a joint commission and finance committee meeting, at least to discuss some of this? As it relates to financing, I know that there's a county human resources and finance committee meeting at 3:30. Our finance committee meeting is at 5:15. So maybe something to consider. Mr. Jean.
But would we have the benefit of the report from Donahue at that point in time?
The council meeting would be following at 6:30, so I would.
Well, I know, but if we're going to do a joint meeting with finance.
Yeah, would you be able to have something prepared?
What
Oh.
time?
The meeting, finance is at 5:15.
Yeah, we can make that. I think our intention would be to have some sort of brief presentation and a lot of information's coming together very, very quickly. It won't be a very thick report, but some sort of memorandum that provides a cost perspective for that meeting, Joe. Mr. Jean.
And obviously, I would have to make sure with the chair of that committee that was okay. I do see the finance director is on this call, so hoping she could make the connection for us. She's busy with taxes right now. Comments or questions, or are we ready to move on? Do we feel good about maybe, oh, I see nodding. Mr. Jean? Nope. Mr. Force? Oh,
Yeah, no, I'm in favor of that.
okay.
I think we should move on.
Okay, we're moving on. We will proceed to explore that joint meeting. Finance, sounds good. All right, now we're on, do we need a break? We've been going for 2 hours. Does anybody need a break here? Seeing shaking heads, we're ready to just plow on through. All right, item number 6, discussion and possible action on approving terms of settlement agreement between Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the City of Wausau, providing for dismissal of both contested case and petition for judicial review. This is the Marathon County case number 19 CV 32. I don't know who wants to, do we need more information?
Ann can come up,
City
but,
attorney.
you know, she prepared most of it, but this is our discharge permit on the wastewater side, and as most of you know, when the permit first came out, we didn't have the TMDLs, and so we had an artificially low phosphorus limit in that discharge permit, so we, my terminology, and we contested the permit. I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, no, good, I don't understand the
Okay.
technical side of
Okay.
it, so thank you for explaining that. But we've been at this since 2019, and so I apologize, my memo doesn't say who authored it or have a heading on it because I thought I was dumping it to Eric to put into a larger staff memo he was going to write.
Time you got.
So it's just 2 pages of my procedural description of what's happened with this, challenging this permit at both the agency level before the DNR and at the circuit court level. So nothing's happened at the circuit court level at all. That's just been punted down the road since the end of 2019. The DNR case was different. We petitioned for a contested case hearing, and they accepted it, but then we kept negotiating with them over the terms of the permit, and they accepted staff's request for the construction deadline to remain June 30th of '23, and then the compliance date 6 months thereafter, 12/31/23. So that was, I think, a win for us. That just came through, and so the DNR has prepared this settlement agreement. Exhibit A is the 44-page permit packet that follows that, was marked as Exhibit A of the settlement agreement itself. And so that would get rid of both cases, but I understand there is a public comment and hearing period of like 70 days or something on this revised permit, and as long as that doesn't change or we don't get a third-party challenge, then the contested case petition would be dismissed.
That's my understanding. Is that the timeline's been? Okay, thanks.
Mr. Jean?
So the issue with the phosphorus limit, I see it's 1 in this draft. And so was there a fractional part of 1 before that?
Can you turn your mic on so I don't get yelled at by public access? Thank you.
I'd have to go through the other versions to see what that actually was. I'm familiar with what it is now.
Well,
I think it was
okay with-
artificially low, like I don't know, point 3?
Point 3 sounds
I
like
believe
the
it
number
was.
would have
I
been.
believe it was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's not in here, so
Correct.
so that's great.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, any questions or comments? Or do I have a motion? Okay, I'm assuming that your motion is to approve the terms of the settlement agreement.
Correct.
Okay, do I have a second? Yep, Mr. Robinson? Oh, yeah, all right.
I was just going to say.
Yep, okay. Any commentary? Okay, all of those in favor of approving the terms of the settlement agreement between Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the City of Wausau, providing for dismissal of both the contested case and petition for judicial review, can signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposition? All right, we are now on to item number 7. Thank you. Discussion and possible action on a budget modification for the Burek Avenue Campus Drive water main project.
So the joys of what we're living in right now for bids, our bids, and I think almost all of our projects are coming over budget. This one is a couple of reasons. One, diameter of our water main increased during final design from 14 to 8-inch piping, and also material costs are significantly going up, but we are about $400,000 over budget with the bids that came in. So we are looking for a budget modification to move ahead with the project and add $400,000 to this project for 2022.
Any questions about this, or do I have a motion? Mr. Jane?
I'll move for the change in the, or the budget change.
Okay, we have a motion to approve a budget modification for this project. Is there a second? I have a second by Herbst. Any discussion or questions? Okay, all of those in favor of approving a budget modification for the Burek Avenue Campus Drive water main project can signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposition? Okay, that passes unanimously. Thank you. We are now on to item number 8, discussion and possible action on utility policy addressing PFAS issues in water and wastewater treatment systems. I might offer the floor to Commissioner Robinson. This is a discussion we've been having as it relates to policy, so maybe you can share your thoughts.
Well, it was here for a couple of reasons. First, I'm glad that we took the action we did tonight, basically agreeing that we would try to be below the proposed health standard, or the MCL, prepared by the Department of Health Services. And I thought it was important that we look to that versus the health advisory level proposed by EPA, because I think it's just a matter of time before EPA proposes lower numbers. And quite honestly, if you look at what other states are doing relative to standards, those numbers are coming down. So I was hoping that we would agree to that, and I think through our action we have. The second one is if you've got water coming into your system, it's going out of your system. And if it's going out of the system, it's in influent and effluent at the wastewater treatment facility, and more than likely it's in biosolids. And I think we need to take, as a utility, a holistic approach to where PFAS are in our system. And I strongly encourage us that if we aren't already, to begin to monitor both the influent, effluent, and biosolids at the wastewater treatment plant, so that we can have, again, that holistic approach to try to minimize the presence of PFAS in the environment. And, if we discharge it, it gets into the river, there's a potential for it to impact down gradient sources of water, and we just continue to do that. So I would hope that we would, as a policy, and, both embrace the Department of Health Services recommendation of the 20 parts per trillion, and commit ourselves to making sure that we have an understanding of the holistic impacts of PFAS on our utility system.
All right.
Where, I guess that leads to the question, where are we relative to sampling at the wastewater plant?
We have not sampled any biosolids at the wastewater plant.
Okay. Mr. Force?
We've talked about it, though. It's in the minutes.
Correct, we have talked about it.
John, would your holistic approach also include source identification? Or at least, let me rephrase that, source investigation. We might not find the source.
Well, I think you have two sources that you're dealing with. One is the source of the groundwater contamination that's impacting the wells, and the second one is a source of potential dischargers in the system. And I think both of those should be undertaken. I think we've been looking to the DNR to do some of that source identification for the drinking water wells, and we might want to try to do that, but that would require some expertise beyond, I think, what we may have internally. But as a policy, we should support source identification in both groundwater and wastewater systems. So if it's appropriate, I would move that the commission embrace the health standards as the standard for which we would address the water quality issue for drinking water, and that we continue to work on expanding our knowledge of PFAS in our wastewater system through influent, effluent, and biosolid testing, and to look for source control where PFAS are present.
Okay, we have a motion to embrace this policy. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
We have a second by Force. Any discussion? Mr. Jean?
I think one of the stumbling blocks that we had concerning at the wastewater is there wasn't approved methodology to test it. Is that still current or correct? So I'm not going to disagree. We need to know where it is and where it's going and et cetera. But I don't want to go out on a limb and find out that we came up with some bad information and made some investments, and serious investments, that our taxpayers or ratepayers may not appreciate. So unless there is, that doesn't mean we still can't make an effort. But we need to be careful again.
Mr. Robinson?
Are you sure that there's no approved methods?
Can you use your mic, please? Thank you.
There are costly methods, yes.
I just don't think that there's a standardized method yet.
Correct.
For, yeah.
Are there no standards for biosolids?
The DNR had, was that in '21, established some guidelines for biosolids. We had talked about those, Joe, or Jim, as you had mentioned. You know, we've talked about biosolids in the past, and I think that, so they have like threshold guidelines, you know, like for different things that they recommend if you exceed. I'm happy to bring those back, you know, for our next meeting too, to do that. We could possibly, you know, get some more information too on where the DNR is at its standardized testing methods and things like that for biosolids.
I guess I would also say that in the conversations I've had with other municipalities who are working through this, particularly Marinette, they were dealing a lot with biosolids, and that is actually most of what they're dealing with. So the consultant they're working with does have that expertise, and maybe part of our request for qualifications, we could consider biosolids as that, or maybe have a separate one. But I do think it is worth our time to investigate because what goes in comes out, right? I'm sorry that I didn't write down the motion that you made, and I feel like I understand the spirit of it, but I'm wondering if you would mind repeating it.
So it was a three-part motion.
Of course it was.
To adopt the Department of Health Services recommendation for 20 parts per trillion for the water. The second was that we evaluate the wastewater influent, effluent, and biosolids. And the third was that we look at source identification for PFAS in the system, and that would be inclusive of in the groundwater and in the influent, if we have any.
Okay.
And I would just point out that DNR was doing sampling at wastewater treatment plants, and Michigan has a history of collecting information relative to biosolids. So there are practices in place, and I'm comfortable delaying that and letting you bring back a report on it, but I think I'd like to also have our policy in place.
Okay.
My observation would be that actually the first concerns, if you will, about PFAS were in relation to biosolids.
Any further discussion on this? Okay, so what we have the motion and the second to adopt the DHS recommendation of 20 parts per trillion for drinking water. We're going to evaluate wastewater influent and effluent, and then investigate the source of PFAS. All those in favor can signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that passes, thank you. All right, we are now on to item number 9, discussion and possible steps moving forward on PFAS removals in water and wastewater treatment systems. I might flip it back over to you, Mr. Robinson, since we've had discussions on this.
Well, I wanted to begin the discussion of where we are, and I think that if we go with the sampling, that can drive that going forward. But I think it would be helpful if we could take some of the charts and the timelines that were laid out in the presentation today, get those in a more resident-friendly manner, and get that out there so people understand where we are in the timelines, just for some more certainty, because I'm getting lots of questions, and I'm sure, Eric, you are getting lots of questions, and it would just be helpful if we could capture that, present it to the public so that they have a better understanding of timelines and expectations.
We can get that on the website.
I would agree with John, and as I've mentioned in the past, I think we should be as transparent as we can be about PFAS and PFAS information, and relying on the website is one step. There are other vehicles of communication that I think we should be pursuing to make sure the public understands the issue and understands what we're doing about it. I think those are two very important communication planks.
I will tell you that I am working with a firm to be able to communicate this a little bit more succinctly and in plain English. So I'll have more on that soon, but I am working actively with folks on this exact topic. Do we need action on this, or do we feel that we've talked about it? Okay. Seeing head nods. All right, discussion on future meeting dates. Looks like we already did that. Next, yep, Mr. Robinson.
Could I request that our joint portion of the meeting begin no earlier than 5:30?
I think we can request that. Yep, I did send a note out, or at least I started to, so get that in there.
And the next regular meeting starts at 7. Are we going to continue
Yep.
to do this?
Do we prefer this, nighttime meeting?
We did this to enable the public to have more access to our meetings.
Yep. I'm here all the time, so I'm good with this. It's you all that need to come in. So I'm fine with this. We won't be able to use this meeting space on April 5th, so maybe we can poll for a date right around that time that works best for everybody, and maybe at the same time talk about times, if that works for you. As long as we are in alignment that we're looking at evening times. Yeah? Okay. All right, I guess I would entertain the last motion here to adjourn. We have a motion by Jean and a second by Herbst. All those in favor can signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you very much, everyone.